Dana White's journey. In the past, if someone said they were watching a fight, it was almost certain they were referring to boxing. Today, however, hearing that is much more likely to mean mixed martial arts or simply MMA. And who's responsible for this transformation? The UFC. It was thanks to the Ultimate Fighting Championship that MMA, once seen as an almost savage combat sport, evolved into something much greater. In less than 30 years, since its first pay-per-view, the UFC has become a commercial phenomenon, valued at billions of dollars, and the homes of some of the most famous athletes on the planet. But the UFC's success didn't happen out of nowhere. It was shaped by a unique champion. And we're not talking about Randy Couture, Anderson Silva, or even Ronda Rousey. The true champion of the UFC, the one who ensured its rise to the top, is Dana White. With strategic vision and unparalleled negotiating skills, he transformed MMA from a marginalized sport into a symbol of modern culture. This is the story of Dana White and the UFC. Until the mid-1970s, mixed martial arts were not common in North America. This changed when Rory Gracie and his family, from Brazil, brought their unique form of jiu-jitsu to the United States in the late 1970s. This style combined various martial arts for close combat fighting. In their efforts to popularize what is now known as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the family produced a series of videos called Gracie's in Action, in which athletes demonstrated the art by defeating fighters from different styles. The video series caught the attention of Art Davie, an advertising executive who dreamed of organizing a fighting tournament to definitively determine which martial art was the most effective. Davie eventually partnered with the Gracies to create the tournament, a nationally televised pay-per-view event called the Ultimate Fighting Championship, or UFC. Thus, on November 12, 1993, in a half-filled arena in Denver, Colorado, the UFC was born. The first event brought together 8 fighters from different styles, including 2 kickboxers, a savage fighter, a karate specialist, a boxer, a shoot fighter, Ken Shamrock, and even a sumo wrestler, Tila Tuli. The tournament had no weight classes or size restrictions. The only rule was simple: win the fight. In the end, it was Royce Gracie, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and Rory Gracie's brother, who became the first UFC tournament champion, defeating all 3 of his opponents on the ground via submission. Initially planned as a one-time event, the UFC surprised everyone by generating nearly 90,000 pay-per-view purchases, prompting Davie and the Gracies to hold consecutive events. However, the UFC faced challenges in gaining acceptance. Its slogan, "There are no rules," and the level of brutality displayed in the fights were something the North American audience was neither accustomed to nor comfortable with. In 1996, concerns about violence in the UFC reached the United States Senate, with then-Senator John McCain of Arizona leading a campaign to ban the sport in all 50 states, calling it human cockfighting. As a result, 36 states passed laws prohibiting no-holds-barred fighting, including New York, which implemented the ban on the eve of UFC 12, forcing the event to relocate from Niagara Falls to Alabama. In response to increasing legal pressures, the UFC began adjusting its rules to align with the regulations of state athletic commissions. Weight classes were introduced, along with bans on actions such as hair pulling, eye gouging, and fish hooking, pulling the inside of an opponent's mouth. By UFC 21, the organization had established unified rules, including the prohibition of kicks to the head of a downed opponent, headbutts, and the introduction of 5-minute rounds. These changes gradually transformed the fights into a more regulated sports competition, moving away from unchecked violence. By that point, Rory Gracie had already distanced himself from the promotion, dissatisfied with the company's disorganization. Art Davie, co-founder of the UFC, had also sold his stake. Both transferred their rights to the UFC's television partner, SEG. However, the new ownership group failed to solve the organization's financial issues. Although the events continued to attract good audiences and significant pay-per-view sales, the UFC remained a financial sinkhole. As spectacular and innovative as it was, the UFC was failing commercially. If it wanted to move beyond its status as a controversial niche sport, it needed a tireless and dedicated leader to take it to the next level. And as fate would have it, that leader was about to emerge. Dana White's journey to leading the UFC began in the 1960s in Manchester, Connecticut. White had to grow up quickly, as his father was an alcoholic and, as he himself described, was never around. His mother worked multiple jobs to support Dana and his sister Kelly. The family moved frequently during White's childhood, alternating between Boston, Connecticut, and Las Vegas. It was in Las Vegas that young White befriended Lorenzo Fertitta, a classmate at Bishop Gorman High School, until White was expelled after disagreements with the nuns. During his youth, White developed a strong interest in fighting. He began training in boxing at the age of 17, but never stood out in the ring. He enrolled in college twice, first at Quincy College and later at the University of Massachusetts, but dropped out of both. To make ends meet, White worked a series of odd jobs, including as a valet at a luxury hotel where he and his coworkers often argued who would keep the larger tips. Eventually, White decided to commit to his dream of working in the fight world. He began learning the ins and outs of boxing from Pete Welsh, a former Golden Gloves champion and a boxing legend in Boston. White started teaching boxing in his basement, and the business grew. He went on to rent local gyms to offer his classes. His name began gaining recognition in the region, but the journey was not without challenges. When he was 21 years old, White was attacked in a bar in Boston, being beaten defenseless for almost 20 minutes until the police arrived. The brutal attack left a lasting impact on Dana White's life. He suffered permanent hearing loss and ear damage that resulted in Meniere's disease, known for causing vertigo-like symptoms. White lived with these symptoms for years before undergoing stem cell therapy, which he claims completely cured him. However, the attack was just the beginning of White's troubles. As his boxing business in Boston continued to grow, it caught the attention of the notorious Winter Hill Gang, led by the infamous Whitey Bulger, portrayed by Johnny Depp in the 2015 film Black Mass. According to White, one day two of Bulger's enforcers interrupted one of his boxing classes and demanded $2,500 or face the consequences. Initially, White didn't take the threat seriously until he received a call from Kevin Weeks, Bulger's right-hand man, who gave him until 1 p.m. the next day to pay. Fearing for his life, White packed his bags and immediately bought a one-way ticket to Las Vegas. And there was Lorenzo Fertitta, White's aforementioned friend. At the time, Lorenzo and his brother Frank had become casino owners in the Las Vegas area around the same time White arrived in Nevada. The trio reunited at a wedding where the Fertitta brothers asked to train with White, who had already moved his boxing business to Las Vegas. The three began training together regularly, and soon White invited an old acquaintance, John Lewis, to join the group. Lewis was an MMA fighter and UFC athlete, having competed in UFC 22 and UFC 28. Training with Lewis, White and the Fertitta brothers fell in love with jiu-jitsu, in which Lewis held a black belt. They became obsessed with MMA and started training constantly, sometimes 3 or 4 times a week. During these sessions, White began building relationships with the fighters Lewis trained, such as Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz, Randy Couture, and BJ Penn. It didn't take long for the entrepreneurial White to start acting as a manager for Lewis, Liddell, and Ortiz, handling their negotiations with the UFC. By representing some of the UFC's biggest stars, White began to understand the inner workings of the promotion. He often attended events and thought about ways to improve the product. On one such occasion, during contract negotiations, White gained access to the UFC's financial records and discovered that the company was on the brink of bankruptcy. Its owner, Bob Mayerowitz, was looking for a buyer. White brought the idea to the Fertitta brothers, who were immediately interested. In January 2001, they purchased the UFC for $2 million. Meyerowitz accepted the offer, and the Fertitta brothers acquired 90% of the company, leaving White with 10% of the shares, along with the title of president. Despite their initial enthusiasm, they knew they had a lot of work ahead. After all, they had bought a failing company that had liquidated all the assets to avoid bankruptcy. Essentially, all White and the Fertitta brothers had acquired was the UFC brand name and an old octagon. But even with these challenges, White and the Fertitta brothers were about to build a sports empire, leveraging the groundwork laid by their predecessors. In the early 2000s, the UFC was still not respected as a promotional brand. During Dana White's first years as president, the company faced numerous difficulties. It couldn't secure pay-per-view events, encountered legal and regulatory obstacles, and suffered from a negative image due to the extreme violence of the sport. This made it nearly impossible to attract sponsors. By 2004, the Fertitta brothers had already invested more than $40 million into the UFC, which was still unprofitable. According to White, the brothers were considering giving up, and Lorenzo even asked him to explore how much they could get by selling the company. It was at that moment they decided to take one final gamble to save their investment and legitimize the UFC. They spent another $10 million to produce a reality show called The Ultimate Fighter. While pay-per-view events limited audience reach, an MMA program on cable television could be revolutionary. The show featured two teams of aspiring fighters competing, with Chuck Liddell and six-time champion Randy Couture as team captains. The fighters lived in a shared house, trained under the guidance of their captains, and eventually faced each other in a tournament. The final winner earned a six-figure contract with the UFC. Despite its appealing format, it was difficult to convince networks to air the show. Finally, Spike TV, a channel targeting young male audiences, agreed to broadcast the reality show, scheduling it right after WWE's Monday Night Raw to capitalize on its audience. The strategy worked. The show was an instant hit, attracting over 1 million viewers for the premiere episode. Along with the captivating fights and fighters, one of the standout elements of the program was Dana White himself, who frequently appeared to add drama to the competition. The success continued to build, and the first season culminated in the first UFC fight broadcast on cable TV between Forrest Griffin and Stephen Bonner. For many, this fight is considered one of the greatest of all time and was credited with saving the UFC. It was an intense battle, with both fighters trading blows throughout most of the fight. Griffin emerged victorious, but both he and Bonner were awarded UFC contracts immediately after the fight. The success of The Ultimate Fighter was so significant that Spike TV and the UFC renewed the show for a second season, signing the contract literally on a napkin. Over 15 years later, the reality show remains on the air. The gamble taken by White and the Fertitta brothers had paid off, catapulting MMA and the UFC into the mainstream. From there, the UFC's popularity exploded, and the organization grew exponentially, expanding its influence and popularity worldwide. In 2007, the UFC purchased its biggest rival, Japan-based Pride Fighting Championship, for $70 million. 4 years later, it acquired another competitor, Strikeforce, paving the way for fighters like Ronda Rousey, Daniel Cormier, and Robbie Lawler to become UFC stars. These acquisitions not only increased the UFC's roster of fighters and library of fights, but also cemented the organization as the world's leading MMA promoter. And the results were remarkable. In 2011, the UFC signed a 7-year, $100 million contract with Fox Sports to broadcast its events. Since then, the sport has become a global phenomenon, with fights held in countries like China, Canada, Australia, the United Arab Emirates, Chile, and many others, in addition to the United States. Meanwhile, UFC fighters like Ronda Rousey, Anderson Silva, Georges St. Pierre, Conor McGregor have become international superstars. The overwhelming success of the UFC also turned Dana White into a celebrity. In 2016, the UFC sold to WME IMG, a California-based talent agency, for an astonishing $4 billion, the largest and most expensive sale of a sports organization in history. And as the years went by, the brand only increased in value. In 2018, the UFC signed a $1.5 billion deal with ESPN, becoming the network's official TV partner. The agreement included the broadcast of 30 Fight Night events on its channels, in addition to 20 more events streamed on the ESPN Plus platform. More recently, the UFC has faced criticism for not paying fighters a fair share of the revenue it generates. In the early 2000s, fighters received about 40% of the organization's revenue. By 2022, this percentage was reported to have dropped to just 16%. And who's been at the center of these controversies? Dana White. He's been the primary target of public criticism, and for some fighters has become the #1 enemy. When asked about fighter pay in 2021, White responded defiantly, saying that anyone is free to start their own MMA promotion and pay fighters whatever they want. But while some people criticize his decisions or his attitude, it's undeniable that it is precisely this determination and strategic skill that made Dana White the face of the UFC. For more than 20 years, he's remained the most recognizable figure in the sport, leading the transformation of MMA from a niche practice, often compared to no-holds-barred fighting, into a global cultural phenomenon. Under his leadership, the UFC went from a promotional company on the brink of bankruptcy to a brand valued at billions of dollars known worldwide. If it weren't for White, none of this would have happened, and some legends of the sport like Anderson Silva and Ronda Rousey might never have been known. It's truly remarkable to think that all of this started in a simple basement of an ordinary house in Boston. This was the story of Dana White. So, what do you think of Dana White's story? Do you know any other details we didn't mention in the video? Share your information with us in the comments. And please don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Leave your like, activate the notification bell, and share this video with your fight-loving friends like us. A big hug.